We've all heard the story of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. John Wilkes Booth sneaks into Ford's Theater, shoots Lincoln, jumps from the balcony, and the rest is history. But that's just the version we're taught one day in history class. But what if I told you that the truth is more complicated, that John Wilkes Booth wasn't acting alone that night? 3 coordinated attacks, 3 assassins moving at once, and one plan meant to decapitate the entire U.S. government. While Booth fired the shot that we all remembered, his partners struck somewhere else. The Secretary of State left bleeding in his own bed. The Vice President marked for death, and an entire network of co-conspirators hiding in plain sight. This wasn't a one-man act, it was an organized plot. And the story that followed is far darker than the one we're taught in history class. So, if you are interested in American history, in one of the most infamous assassinations ever done on our soil, this is the episode for you. This is the Lincoln Conspirators. So, sit back, relax, and welcome to History Camp. What's up, people, and welcome back to History Camp. My name is Mark Gagnon, and thank you for joining me in my tent where every single week we explore the most interesting, fascinating, controversial stories from all around the world, from all history that's ever happened. Yes, this is my attempt where I sit in this very tent and try to understand everything that's ever happened on this planet, on this entire earth, in this country, and in every country that's ever existed. It's just, small task, but someone's got to do it. This is my pushing the rock up the hill. I am Sisyphus, and the rock is everything ever. But as always, I can't do this alone. Of course, I need you people at home that are watching along, which I appreciate. And also, I need my good friend, Christos Papadopoulos, the Greek freak. Christos, Yasus.
Kalispera, Mark.
Kalispera. Tikanis?
Kala, εσύ τι κάνεις.
All right, enough. Okay, the audience is already getting bored. They don't like hearing you talk English. They definitely don't want you to hear you talk Greek.
They made that clear.
They made that pretty clear. How was my Greek there, though?
It was pretty good.
I'm learning it just for you. But guys, today we're not talking about anything Greek. We're talking about the one and only John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln, one of our best presidents ever. Now, we did a whole episode on, American presidential assassinations. We went through the anthology of all the successful ones, the many, many, many attempted ones. I mean, basically every single U.S. president has had a threat on their life. And the John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln story is actually pretty deep. I'll be honest, this is not super crazy conspiracy vibes. This is just the actual things that happened that never get talked about. And there are so many crazy things about this plot that I'm very excited to jump into today. But in order to understand this, we got to go back to the very beginning. I'm sure you guys know generally who Abraham Lincoln is, right? 7 years ago, that whole thing. That's what it is, 7 years. Yeah, Gettysburg Address. You know which one I'm talking about, all right? But today we're talking about John Wilkes Booth. That's where our story begins. So, John Wilkes Booth was born May 10th, 1838 in Bel Air, Maryland. And now this is just already off rip where this gets so fascinating. He was born to a woman named Mary Ann Holmes, but also to a man named Junius Brutus Booth. That was his actual father's name. Now, if you don't know, this is just a little fun fact from history that I find fascinating. His father was literally named Junius Brutus Booth. Now, if you're familiar with who Junius Brutus is, he is literally the guy that kills Julius Caesar. Not only in Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, but literally the actual Julius Caesar. Remember when Caesar turns around and goes, "Et tu, Brute"? He's talking about Junius Brutus. His dad was named after the man that killed the president of ancient Rome. Crazy little sidebar. It's almost as if he was destined to, assassinate I don't want to compare Abraham Lincoln with Julius Caesar, but just think of it like a head of state. You know what I mean? A man who, was loved by the people generally, that some people thought was a tyrant. And, let me tell you, John Wilkes Booth thought that Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant. I mean, for the wrong reasons. I mean, Abraham Lincoln just freed the slaves and was, unifying the entire nation. But John Wilkes Booth didn't like that because he was racist. We'll get into more of that later. But just a crazy thing off rip that he's literally born to the guy who's named after the dude who stabs Julius Caesar. Crazy. He is one of the youngest of 10. He's the 9th child out of 10. And for his time, he was a star. His dad, Junius, was one of the biggest Shakespearean actors of the early 1800s. But Junius was also pretty unstable. Okay, he was a heavy drinker. At one time, he even wrote a letter to Andrew Jackson threatening to assassinate him, and then he wrote an apology letter. It was a whole thing. So John, he gets it pretty honestly from his dad, as you can imagine. Okay, so John is one of the younger siblings, and he was super jealous of his brother Edwin, who would go on to become basically like the Daniel Day-Lewis of his time. There's actually a Booth Theater in New York City still to this day named after Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's brother, which is just another crazy thing. So by the time John Wilkes Booth hits his 20s, he's pulling in serious money. He's a very prominent actor. And between 1863 and 1864, John Wilkes Booth earns like almost $1 million in today's money. It's around like $20,000 in that time. But keep in mind, like President Lincoln's salary is $25,000. So he's almost making what the president makes just as an actor. Now, he's starring in plays across the South where people basically worship him. I mean, he's walking around, women are throwing flowers at him, critics are calling him the most handsome man in America. Other actors are describing him as impossible not to admire. Like he's basically just like the most beloved actor specifically in the South at the time. But you see, John Wilkes Booth, the success and the money and the adulation isn't enough. He wanted Edwin's level of respect, and throughout his whole life, his brother was just slightly, more sought after. He was more admired, more revered, more respected in the acting world. I mean, Edwin even forbid John from performing anywhere near his appearances, worried about overloading the American theater with, the Booth family. So to really understand John, you have to understand that he loved Shakespeare, he loved women, and he really loved the South. Now, Maryland, where he was born and basically where he lived, was technically the Union, but Booth saw himself as a Confederate. He smuggled medical supplies to Confederate troops during his travels. Like, he would literally go down south to do a show and bring in, like, quinine, like, to, help, like, the troops in the South with malaria, all this stuff. And he even joined a Virginia company that helped capture and execute abolitionist John Brown after the raid on Harper's Ferry. I mean, the guy was, like, a committed ideologue. So as the Civil War is ramping up, John hates the North, and he's just growing in his hatred for the North. He even called Lincoln a tyrant. He called him the black Republican who was destroying the Constitution. At parties, he would literally make toasts saying, "Here's hoping that the tyrant dies." But his hatred wasn't just political, it was personal. So when Lincoln won re-election on a platform basically advocating the abolishment of slavery, Booth told his sister Asia, "That man's appearance, his pedigree, his coarse, low jokes and anecdotes, his vulgar smiles, and his policy are a disgrace to the seat he holds." He genuinely believed that Lincoln was leading America towards, just anarchy. He hated these ideas of racial mixing and the destruction of white civilization. And again, like, these aren't just like drunken rants at the time, because in 1864, Booth was already cooking up plans to kidnap Lincoln and smuggle him to Richmond, Virginia. So you have to understand, like, John Wilkes Booth was a real racist Southern Confederate ideologue. He was like, we are a white nation. We got to protect this. We can't have racial mixing. And this guy, Abraham Lincoln, is trying to send our country into disarray by allowing equality. Like, he was really who he was. Now, what's crazy is that there's another coincidence here that makes the whole thing just sound fake, okay? But it's not. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because you might need a little bit of help, all right? As we know, our society is very sexual, right? It is in everything. We are constantly being marinated in sexual garbage, memes, music videos, Instagram. You're just scrolling and bang, there it is. And then that leads you down a little rabbit hole. You pop into the hub. Yeah. You pop into the hub, and it might be sucking the life out of you and dudes everywhere. Yes, killing your motivation, your relationships, your happiness from just, gooning all the time. And that's why I want to tell you about something really important called Relay. Relay is the first app that actually helps you quit porn for good. It doesn't just tell you like, do better. It gives you like little affirmations every day. It actually gives you tools that work, real accountability and actual encouragement and support to help you succeed. It's not about guilt or moralizing or telling you you're a bad person. It's about helping you grow to be the best person you can be. So if you're tired of feeling stuck, this is your sign to do something about it. So download Relay, start your 7-day free trial with the code GAGNON, and start building some real freedom. There are thousands of guys that are already doing this and getting their lives back through Relay, and you can too. So seriously, stop gooning. Stop being a gooner, all right? At least for like a couple of weeks, right? Maybe a month, right? Just do your best, okay? We're all in this journey together trying to be better men. So if you're interested, go to joinrelay.app/camp and become the person that you know you can be. Now let's get back to the show. John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin, the guy that he admired and always wanted to be, he actually saved Abraham Lincoln's son's life. Just as a crazy little side note, Robert Todd Lincoln, who also has a bunch of crazy things in his own life. Basically, Robert Todd Lincoln fell onto train tracks in like crowded New Jersey train station. And this is in like 1864, 1865. And Edwin Booth grabbed the 21-year-old Robert Lincoln by the collar and pulled him back to safety. And Robert recognized the famous actor and was like, holy shit, did you just save my life? Like, thank you so much. And Edwin didn't even realize whose son that he had rescued until much later. So yeah, one Booth literally saved a Lincoln and the other one killed a Lincoln, which is just another crazy thread in this whole thing. Another crazy fun fact in this whole saga, the only time that all three Booths, like, Julius, the father, Edwin, and John Wilkes Booth all played and performed together was in a production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in November 1864. And John Wilkes Booth was playing Mark Antony, the character in the play who avenges Caesar's assassination. So just as like the foreshadowing and like all the parallels are just insane. But anyway, basically, John Wilkes Booth created the first plan, and this was a kidnapping. So by late 1864, the Confederacy is losing the war and Booth is spiraling. So he comes up with this plan. And we're just going to kidnap Lincoln. We're going to blackmail the Union, convince them to exchange prisoners of war for his return, and we'll continue the Confederate effort. And this is when everything begins to fall in place. He gathers a crew at a D.C. boarding house run by a lady named Mary Surratt. This was a widowed businesswoman who basically her house became like, the headquarters for like Confederate sympathizers and just like conspiracy headquarters, more or less. So Booth is then introduced to John Surratt. This is Mary's son and a Confederate courier. So literally a man who was like delivering messages into the South, from the South into the North. He became sort of like the conduit. And they met through a man named Dr. Samuel Mudd, who's going to become important later, but we'll get to him. Booth kept on asking Surratt about trails leading from Washington to the Potomac River without telling him why he wanted the information. But when Surratt finally demanded to know what Booth wanted after weeks of avoiding the questions, Booth basically reveals his plan to kidnap the president, take him to Richmond, and exchange him for thousands of Confederate prisoners. Now, the team for this whole operation consisted of a few people. David Harold, who was John Wilkes Booth's sidekick, he was like a 22-year-old pharmacist assistant who basically followed him everywhere and like knew the back roads of Southern Maryland from like hunting trips. He had Lewis Powell, who at the time was going by Lewis Payne, who was an ex-Confederate soldier, who was just like a big, dumb meathead type guy. He was also a former member of Mosby's Rangers, who was wounded at Gettysburg. And again, just kind of like a dolt. And then you had George Atzerodt, who was the getaway guy. Now, he was a German immigrant, basically, who was like repairing carriages as a job. And despite living in America most of his life, couldn't really speak English that well. So this is the squad. This is the crackpot team that's going to be kidnapping Lincoln, okay? So Booth basically rehearsed practice runs in the back roads of Maryland. And the conspirators basically were like stocking ropes and chloroform and pistols. And they were putting all this stuff in the attic of the Surratt attic, basically this woman and her son. But the issue was that they didn't know how to actually complete their plan. So they made a bunch of different scenarios. One insane idea was to kidnap him from the theater, tie him up, and then lower him from the balcony to the stage, and then take him from the stage out of the theater. But then that plan didn't really shape up for obvious reasons. So then they planned to ambush Lincoln's carriage as he was returning from a nearby play. But to their luck, he changed his schedule at the last minute and he stayed in Washington. So after weeks of failed attempts, Booth's plan was falling apart and the Confederate effort was falling apart even more. And then came the final blow. April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders to the General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the South is done. It's over. The Southern resistance is done for, and the Union has won. And this causes Booth to basically freak out and change the plan from kidnapping, because now he doesn't have any more leverage because the war is basically done, and he wants to do something much darker: assassination. So when they gathered for a second attempt in early April, Booth basically told them the new plan, and the goal was now to murder the president and at least 3 other Northern leaders. They wanted to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Ulysses S. Grant. So fast forward 5 days, now it's April 14th, and Lincoln wants a night off. Lucky for him, the Ford Theater is having a play called Our American Cousin. This is like a British comedy. Now, originally the Lincolns were supposed to be joined by Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia. But Julia and Mary Lincoln weren't really getting along at the time, so of course, Ulysses and his wife backed out. fortunately for them. Lincoln then invites Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, who then accepted the invitation. That night, Mary developed a headache and wanted to stay home, but Lincoln said newspapers had already announced his attendance, so he couldn't miss it. He told his bodyguard, William Crook, "It has been advertised that we will be there, and I cannot disappoint the people. Otherwise, I would not go." So, I mean, fellas, if your lady's complaining about a headache, doesn't want to go to something, just hear her out. That might be a gift from God, maybe a sign from above. That's all I'm saying, okay? Because what happens next, I think you basically already know. That afternoon, John Wilkes Booth stopped by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. Again, he's performing at the theater all the time. His mail is getting sent directly to the theater. And this is something that he did, often, right? So while chatting with the staff, he learned that Lincoln and Grant were expected that evening. Although at the time, he didn't know that Grant was backing out. So he met with his co-conspirators around 8:45 p.m. to finalize the plot. Booth would sneak in and assassinate Lincoln. Lewis Powell would attack Secretary of State William Seward, and then George Atzerodt would then kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel. And David Harold was basically to guide Powell to the home of Seward, and then they would meet Booth at a point in Maryland, and then they would all escape. And the goal was ultimately to decapitate the Union government in one coordinated strike, every major power player gone. The Lincolns arrived at the theater a little bit late, but despite that, when they entered their presidential box, the entire audience, roughly 1,700 people, rise to their feet, and the orchestra starts playing Hail to the Chief as Lincoln sat in his famous rocking chair. He sits down, and again, the energy in the theater is just electric. Everyone's like, we did it, the Union won, the good guys triumphed, like equality in America is like finalized, like there's no more like this is great, everyone's feeling so good. Mary Lincoln held her husband's hand during the show, and it's said that she asked him, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln smiled and said, "She won't think anything about it." Those would be his last known words. Now, normally Lincoln had strong protection. But again, this was prior to Secret Service, but typically, large, prominent heads of state would have some type of security. But that night, his security was a disaster. His regular bodyguard, this guy Ward Hill Lamon, was away in Richmond, and William Crook had the day off. Again, everyone's like, dude, the war's over. The good guys won. Let's just move on. It's fine. The man in charge was Officer John Frederick Parker, but Parker had a reputation for being unreliable. He had a bunch of different disciplinary write-ups, even before ever being assigned to guard the president. And on this day, he arrived 3 hours late to his shift, and during intermission, he left the presidential box unguarded to go drink at the Star Saloon next door, which coincidentally is the same bar Booth was hanging out before the assassination. At around 10:10 p.m., Booth entered through the front door of the theater and made his way to the upper level and actually handed Lincoln's valet, this guy Charles Forbes, his calling card in order to access the box. And remember, he knew the layout of the theater perfectly. He had been there thousands of times. And another wild fun fact, earlier that day when he was getting his mail, John Wilkes Booth drilled a peephole into the door of the presidential box so that he could actually peep inside without actually going in, seeing if the president was really there. Booth then wedged a wooden stick behind the outer door to block access from anyone entering. And he waited for the loudest laugh in the play when actor Harry Hawk said, "Don't know the manners of a good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dozeling old man-trap." At that moment, the audience burst into laughter. Lincoln himself is said to have been laughing, and at that exact moment, 10:15 p.m., Booth stepped forward and fired his single shot off, a .41 caliber Derringer, into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The bullet entered behind his left ear and lodged near the front of his skull. Lincoln then slumped forward, and Major Rathbone turned to see Booth and lunged at him, but Booth pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the arm before leaping 12 feet from the box to the stage. When Booth jumped, his spur actually caught the flag that was draped over the box, and then he landed and broke his leg. Despite this, he raised his knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," literally meaning, "thus always to tyrants," in Latin. Some witnesses claim they heard him add, "the South is avenged," at the end, but others swore that he only said "sic semper tyrannis" before running off stage. At first, the audience thought that this was like a part of the show. They thought maybe this was like a crazy character, like an American guy during this British, sort of comedy. They didn't understand what was happening until Mary Lincoln started to scream. As chaos erupted, an Army officer named Major Joseph Stewart was sitting in the front row and jumped on stage and actually chased Booth during the commotion. Booth also slashed the orchestra leader, William Withers Jr. Now, it's also worth noting that at this exact show, it was actually full of a lot of different military personnel. Again, this was a popular theater in D.C. The war was basically over, and a lot of people wanted to celebrate. So there's a ton of active military in the theater, all the high-ranking generals, etc. So eventually, Booth makes it outside, and he made his way to the stables to find the stable worker holding his horse. He pushes him out of the way, jumps on his horse, and rides away into the night, heading for Maryland. Once everyone realizes what had happened, Charles Leal, a young Union Army surgeon, made his way to the door of the presidential box, but he couldn't get it open until Rathbone noticed the wooden brace that Booth had actually used to jam the door shut. When inside, Leal and a bystander named William Kent cut away Lincoln's collar, unbuttoned his shirt, looking for what they thought was a stab wound. Once Leal located the gunshot wound behind his ear, he realized that the bullet was too deep to remove. Knowing Lincoln couldn't survive a bumpy carriage ride to the White House, Leal decided to move him to the nearest house on 10th Street. So 7 men carefully carried the president outside in the pouring rain. When they made it outside, a man pointed them to the home of a local tailor named William Peterson, just across the street. Inside, there was only a small first-floor bedroom, and Lincoln, being too tall for the bed, was actually laid diagonally across it. And once the whole room was cleared, even of Mrs. Lincoln, the doctors examined the president for other injuries, and they found none. They applied hot water bottles and cloths and blankets to warm up his body, but they all agreed that Lincoln would not survive. And the very next morning, April 15th, Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. But remember, Abraham Lincoln wasn't the only person that was involved in this plot. Booth wasn't the only one who was supposed to be attacking. His partner, Lewis Powell, was carrying out his part of the plan across town, killing the Secretary of State, William Seward, who was actually recovering from a almost deadly carriage ride incident 9 days earlier and was just bedridden in his home on Lafayette Square. So at 10:10 p.m., the same time that Booth entered Lincoln's box, Powell and David Harold arrived at the Seward house. Powell was carrying an 1858 Whitney revolver and a Bowie knife. When he knocked on the door, Seward's servant, William Bell, answered. Powell claimed that he was delivering medicine from a doctor and had to show Secretary Seward personally how to take it. The servant sort of kind of hesitated, but then eventually let him inside. At the top of the stairs, Powell was stopped again by Seward's son, Assistant Secretary Frederick Seward, asking what he was doing in their house. He then repeated the medicine story, but Frederick told him that his father was asleep. And just at that moment, Seward's daughter, Fanny, poked her head out of the door and said, "Fred, father's awake now." Powell then turned as if to leave, then suddenly swung back, drawing his revolver aimed at Frederick's forehead and pulled the trigger. But the crazy thing is that the gun misfired. Powell then smashed the pistol into Frederick's skull, knocked him unconscious, and charged into Seward's bedroom. Fanny screamed as Powell attacked the secretary, slashing him across the face and the neck, but miraculously, a jaw splint saved Seward's life by blocking the blade from actually reaching his jugular vein. Still, the wounds were gruesome and his face would be scarred for life. Hearing the screams, Seward's other son, Augustus, and Sergeant George Robinson burst into the room, and both were stabbed while trying to protect the Secretary of State. As Augustus went for the pistol, Powell fled downstairs, stabbing a State Department messenger, Emmerich Hansel, on the way out. When he made it outside, he allegedly shouted, I'm mad," and he vanished into the dark. Now, remember that guy Harold that I told you about, the getaway guy? He was basically tasked with taking Powell to Seward's location. Well, he was terrified by the noise and all the screaming and thought that he would get caught, so he just bolted and basically left Powell completely alone. But while Booth was fleeing the theater and Powell's knife was basically slashing in the Seward residence, another man was supposed to strike, but never did. Now, this guy, George Atzerodt, was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel in Washington, and Booth's plan was basically for Atzerodt to knock on Johnson's door, stab him, and then leave. Pretty straightforward. But Atzerodt, as we probably can tell, was not really built for murder, right? This is like a German immigrant. It doesn't really speak a ton of English, and was maybe not as much of an ideologue. He was kind of entranced by John Wilkes Booth's fame. So earlier that day, he checked into a room directly above Johnson's, but by nighttime, he was getting nervous. And he was getting so nervous that instead of approaching Johnson's room, he went downstairs to the bar, pistol and knife tucked into his coat, and just wanted to have a drink, just to kind of, take the edge off. And then he does maybe the dumbest thing ever done in assassination attempt history. He starts to ask the bartender questions about the Vice President Johnson and just asking about his character, his habits, what kind of guy he was, almost like he was trying to convince himself that like the Vice President deserved it. But the alcohol didn't make him brave. It just sort of made him sloppy. And he ended up getting so drunk and walking the streets. And somewhere along the way, he threw his knife into a gutter and then ended up renting another hotel room and fell asleep. Now, what's crazy is that John Wilkes Booth actually stopped by the Kirkland Hotel himself and left a cryptic note at the front desk intended for Vice President Johnson. And it literally read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." Historians still debate to this day why he did this, but some think that Booth was checking if Johnson would actually be there that night, while others believed that maybe he wanted to frame the vice president, essentially planting like a breadcrumb that would make people suspicious as to why the vice president was in contact with, Southern, sympathizers and conspirators, maybe making it look like the vice president was the one that wanted Abraham Lincoln to die so that he could become president. But even though we don't know the actual motive, one thing is certain: that night changed America forever. So about half an hour after shooting Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, Booth was crossing the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland when a Union soldier named Silas Cobb stopped him for traveling after curfew. But Booth said that he was heading home to Charles County, so Cobb just let him go. And about an hour later, David Harold crossed the same bridge, giving basically the same excuse. The two men met up and they stopped by Mary Surratt's Tavern in Surrattsville. There, they collected their guns and their supplies that they cached there earlier that they could take them while they're on the run. From there, they rode through the night to Dr. Samuel Mudd's farm. Now, this is the man that Booth had actually met John Surratt. This is the guy that actually connected them. Now, remember, Booth's leg is broken this entire time since he jumped off the balcony onto the stage at Ford's Theater. So Dr. Mudd actually fixed the fracture, made him some crutches, and let him rest there until the following day. Now, after leaving the Mudds, Booth and Harold were guided to the homes of Samuel Cox and Thomas Jones, both Confederate sympathizers. Jones hid them for 5 days in the Zacchaeus Swamp, and he brought them food and newspapers the whole time while they were hiding out. And Booth was actually surprised to read the newspapers because he was expecting that people would love him, they would adore him. He thought that they would see him as a guy that saved America. But instead, the general public, both in the North and even in the South, saw him as a criminal. And in his mind, he was a hero. He was embodying Brutus, and he felt as if, he was saving the Confederacy and saving America, the same way that, Brutus saved Rome from Julius Caesar, the tyrant. And he wrote, "For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat." He couldn't believe it. He literally thought, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to be revered as a hero. I'm going to be beloved, even greater than my brother Edwin, more than my father. I will be seen as the man that took down the greatest tyrant America ever saw. That's how much of a committed sort of racist ideologue John Wilkes Booth was. So by April 24th, John Wilkes Booth had been a fugitive for 10 days. His broken leg had been splinted and kind of prepared and healed up by Dr. Mudd, but all the walking through the swamps and getting dirty made his leg way worse, and it actually caused them to stop consistently along the way. And after spending several nights in the woods, the two finally crossed the Potomac River into Virginia and arrived at the farm of Richard Garret near Port Royal. Now, Booth introduced himself under the alias Boyd, claiming to be a wounded Confederate soldier returning home. Now, Garrett's sons believed his story and actually offered them shelter in their tobacco barn on the back part of their property. Now, Booth reportedly bragged about his time in the Confederate Army, claiming that his wound was from being shot by Union soldiers, but 2 days later, on April 26th, the Garretts started to get a little bit suspicious, and for the right reasons. Around 2 a.m., Union cavalry surrounded the Garret farm, and they entered the home, and they pulled John Garret from his bed at gunpoint, and they asked him who is in their barn, who did they hide there? And John told them that it was just two strangers, but the soldiers then forced the entire family outside to question them. Harold saw from the barn and started begging Booth to let him leave, saying that he didn't want to die. Booth then told him to just leave and called him a coward. When Harold surrendered, he was immediately taken into custody, but Booth wanted to stay in the barn. He wanted a shootout. He stayed there with his carbine and a pistol and refused to leave. After several warnings, the soldiers surrounded the barn, and they actually set fire to it to basically get him to run out. They wanted him to surrender, to leave, and they were going to capture him. But Booth never ran. So as the fire grew, Sergeant Boston Corbett fired a single shot through the gap in the wall, and it hit Booth in the neck. It shattered his spine, and it paralyzed him. He was then pulled from the burning barn and laid in the grass. He reportedly asked a soldier to raise his hands so that he could see them. And when the soldier did, Booth said, "Useless, useless." He died a few hours later, around 7 a.m., at the age of 26. His body was carried back to Washington, D.C., and identified by several people, including his doctor and a photographer who had known him for years. Booth's remains were initially buried at a secret grave at the old penitentiary in the Washington Arsenal, but years later, his family was allowed to move him to Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, where he is to this day. So they got John Wilkes Booth. The bad guy is gone, but there are all the other accomplices. So there was an investigation that was led forward by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who made it very clear anyone connected to Booth would be found and punished. And within days, dozens of people were arrested. But 5 names stood out: Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and oddly enough, Mary Surratt and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, after Powell's attack on Seward, he ran away, leaving his horse behind, and for 3 days he hid in the woods outside Washington, but he eventually made his way back to Mary Surratt's boarding house, the same place where the assassination plot had actually been planned, and the same woman and son that actually facilitated their escape. Inside, Mary was already being questioned by Union soldiers on the whereabouts of the other accomplices, but she claimed that she had no part in anything, and she didn't know anyone, and she had no involvement at all. But just at that moment, Powell arrived at the door, still covered in Seward's blood, and walked inside. The soldiers grabbed him. They start questioning him about where he'd been, and he basically said that Mrs. Surratt sent him to go dig a ditch, but that's when the detectives noticed his bloody hands, and they asked who he was. At that moment, Powell froze, and Mrs. Surratt panicked, and they both sealed their fates. Powell and Mary were then tackled to the ground and arrested on the spot. Atzerodt is the one who never followed through. He sort of just got too drunk and nervous and, ditched his knife. And investigators basically learned that Atzerodt had rented a room at the Kirkwood and left behind a revolver, a Bowie knife, and a map of Virginia. All the evidence you really need. From there, they traced him to his cousin's home, Hartman Richter, and his farm at Germantown, about 20 miles away. And there, soldiers surrounded the property. Atzerodt tried to hide in the attic, but a search party found him under a pile of straw. When confronted, he broke down immediately and confessed that he was a part of, the Booth group, and that basically, he said that, he was too big of a coward to do his job. He was then arrested and taken back to Washington. Now, Harold's story ended at Garret's farm, but after being captured, he was kept aboard the USS Montauk, where he was interrogated for days. He tried to portray himself as like an innocent follower. He didn't really know what he was doing. He was a boy who had simply done what Booth told him to do, but that didn't work out for him, clearly. Now, Dr. Samuel Mudd's involvement may be the weirdest. His connection became obvious once detectives started to retrace, Booth's steps and learned that locals had mentioned a wounded man who had stopped at the home of a country doctor. When troops arrived at Mudd's farm near Bryantown, Maryland, they began interrogating him. Mudd claimed that he had treated an injured stranger who gave the name Booth, but insisted he didn't recognize the famous actor. But the lie didn't hold up. When investigators began searching Mudd's home, they found a pair of men's riding boots with J. Wilkes carved inside the leather. And when showed the evidence, Mudd basically broke down and admitted to having lied about Booth's identity. He was then arrested and transported to Washington to join the other prisoners. And then by early May, all of the major conspirators were in custody, and Stanton ordered that they be tried before a military commission, not a civilian court, and they argued that Lincoln's assassination was an act of war. So the trial began on May 9th, 1865, and lasted for several weeks, with more than 360 witnesses testifying. And on July 6th, the tribunal sentenced Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt to death. The executions took place at 1:26 p.m. the very next day in the courtyard of the Washington Arsenal prison, with roughly 1,000 people lined up to watch. Mary Surratt was brought out first, wearing a black dress and a veil. It's said that she whispered to the guards and said her final words, "Please don't let me fall." Lewis Powell stood by her. His priest told him he was going to a better life, and witnesses even noted that he adjusted the noose on himself before the hood went on. David Harold was next. He was terrified and had to be helped up the steps. When the hood was placed over his head, he simply just said, "Goodbye." George Atzerodt was the last on the scaffold. He was visibly terrified and reciting prayers. His final words, spoken just before the drop, were, "May we meet in another world, God take me now. At precisely 1:26 p.m., the executioner, Captain Wrath, clapped his hands and a single lever dropped all 4 conspirators at once. Surratt died almost immediately, but the men struggled for several minutes before going still. The officer noted in his log that the drop was 6 feet, death by strangulation certain. The bodies hung for about 25 minutes before being cut down. The Army surgeons officially declared them dead. They were placed in plain pine coffins labeled only with their initials. They were then buried in shallow graves along the prison wall. Major Thomas Eckert, who was present that day, wrote in his report, "It was a solemn scene, but the work was done quickly and with order. No exultation, only the feeling that justice had been met." Now, of course, we can't forget about old Dr. Mudd. Now, instead of death, he was sentenced to life at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, but he was later pardoned after helping during a yellow fever outbreak. Now, fun fact, the yellow fever ended up killing the only physician at the prison. Now, Dry Tortugas, if you don't know, that's off the coast of Florida. It's kind of an insane thing. It's like an army fort that's near the coast. You can go visit it still to this day. But basically, yellow fever swept through and the prisons were hit particularly bad. And at the prison at Dry Tortugas, the physician dies. And then Dr. Mudd steps up to basically help the sick. The surviving soldiers actually wrote to President Andrew Johnson, yes, the same man that Booth tried having killed, and described how Mudd had risked his life to care for, both prisoners but also officers, and President Johnson then issued Mudd a full pardon in 1869. Oh, and if you're wondering about John Surratt, this is Mary Surratt's, Confederate sympathizing son. Well, he escaped, kind of. John managed to escape the country using a network of former Confederate contacts. First, he went to Canada, and then across the Atlantic to Europe, where he served in the Papal Zouaves. This is basically like an army that was used to defend the Vatican. So picture that. He escapes from America, goes to Canada, goes to Europe, becomes a part of the people that are in charge of protecting the Pope and the entire Vatican. And then he eventually gets captured in Egypt in 1866 and brought back to the United States for trial. But despite overwhelming evidence linking him to Booth, the jury failed to reach a verdict, and he was released. Which it maybe is just like one of the more insane stories of anyone in American history. I mean, crazy life. Ultimately, Edwin Stanton declared the case closed, and the country turned its attention to the monumental task of Reconstruction, which would have been difficult with Lincoln and infinitely more difficult without him. But even after closure and after the hangings, questions still lingered about who truly pulled the strings and how deep this web of conspiracy really goes. And that, my friend, is the full story of the Lincoln conspirators. I mean, pretty crazy. Like, there's so many other, little connections. Like, there's one little thread that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It's been a minute since I looked into this, but Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, who was actually saved by Edwin Booth, that guy, was present for 3 different presidents' assassinations in some way, shape, or form. I think he saw his father before he officially died when he was just like a young boy. He was like in his 20s, I think. And then he saw James Garfield, and then he saw McKinley. So Garfield got assassinated on the train tracks of, I think, D.C., and he was shot by this guy, I think it was Guiteau.
Charles
Guiteau. And he got shot by him because he was like a crazy guy. And then they hired a doctor, and it was actually Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, that called the doctor to go and put his fingers inside the bullet holes, and he got infected and basically died 100 days later. And then Robert Lincoln, being the son of, Abraham Lincoln, basically gets a cabinet position working for William McKinley. And then William McKinley at the World's Fair in Buffalo gets shot by this guy Colgosh, who was a socialist. And he's big anarchist socialist vibes, and shoots McKinley during a meet and greet. And Robert Lincoln hears the bullet go off, and he's in the other room, and he's like, did another president get assassinated? And he was there for 3 of them. Crazy. And actually, Robert Lincoln's whole life is actually sort of sad. He has quotes later on, I think he wrote a book or a memoir. And he basically is everyone knows me as Abraham Lincoln's son, but no one truly knows Robert Lincoln, not even me. Or something like that. It's sort of heartbreaking. His father gets assassinated. He starts working for these 2 other presidents. They get assassinated. And he just kind of floats around just being the son of this American hero but never really like known in his own right.
It's kind of a bizarro good luck Chuck
Kind of.
Yeah.
He's like bad luck Rob. Like that's him, dude. It's crazy. I mean, did you know anything about the other Lincoln conspirators or like the whole web of how deep this goes?
This is all crazy to me. I've never heard of it, but also they tried to take out the president, the vice president, and the secretary of something at the same time.
And they got close. They got basically like, I would say 1.25 way there, you know? And then of course, do you know the Lincoln Kennedy synchronicities? Like there's so many like little ones. So we can go through the list here. This went around, like if you guys don't know this went around in like email chains back in the day. But basically like Lincoln and Kennedy, two famous presidents that got assassinated, they both have weird things. I think Lincoln was actually the first American president to get assassinated while sitting, and Kennedy is the last, thus far to get assassinated. But Lincoln and Kennedy both have 7 letters. They were both elected to Congress in 1846, 1946, and later to the presidency in 1860 and 1960. Both assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, were both born in 1939. They're known by their 3 names, composed of 15 letters. Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald from a warehouse and caught in a theater. The assassins were both Southerners. Both of the president's successors were Democrats named Johnson, Andrew Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, with 6-letter first names, both born in 1808, 1908. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were both concerned with civil rights. They were both shot in the head on a Friday in the presence of their wives. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who told him not to go to Ford's Theater. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln who warned him not to go to Dallas. Both Oswald and Booth were killed before they could be put on trial. Pretty wild. I mean, the wildest one is that Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was killed in a Lincoln. I mean, like...
That's my favorite one.
Pretty crazy. Like, one was killed in a Ford. The other one... Wait, is that what it is? One was killed in a Ford, the other one was killed in a Lincoln?
Right.
Crazy. Is Lincoln made by Ford?
No.
No, that's the brand.
Yeah.
I'm dumb. And then, another good one. I don't even know if this one's true. That prior to being assassinated, Lincoln was in Monroe, Maryland. And prior to being assassinated, Kennedy was inside Maryland, Monroe. That's a wild one. I mean, you can't really prove it, though.
Okay, that's my favorite.
But there's so many crazy ones. I mean, it's just like insane. Again, maybe it's, maybe that's just synchronicities and how the world works. I don't know. Have you ever heard of the Booth mummy? No. This is a wild thing. So there's all these conspiracies that John Wilkes Booth actually escaped. Because again, like he was like burned in this, barn. Some people say that like he had another person that was in the barn with him and that the body that they dragged out was actually the wrong body, that it was another guy that died, and that John Wilkes Booth escaped out the back and that they dragged out some other dude. Some people think that like they couldn't find him. And so like Stanton, the Secretary of War was just like, we got him, even though they didn't actually get him. So there's all these theories, all these people that claim to have been John Wilkes Booth. So there's a famous one where there's this drifter guy named David George, and he took his own life in Oklahoma in 1903, and locals began saying a few years before his death that he was privately confessing to people that he was actually John Wilkes Booth. And so the news spreads around, and there's a Memphis attorney named Finis Bates who basically comes in. Bates had some connections through George, through family, and decided to claim his body. Then, here's what's weird, years earlier, Bates had met a man from Texas named John St. Helen, who, while sick and believing that he was near death, he told Bates the same thing. He said, I'm John Wilkes Booth, like on his deathbed. So Bates knows a guy who claims he's John Wilkes Booth. Bates then knows another guy who basically everyone also said that's John Wilkes Booth. And so when he sees George's body, he decides to merge the two stories. And so basically, the man in Texas and the dead guy in Oklahoma, it makes for like this great story. He even wrote a book about it called The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, and spent years trying to convince people that the mummy of this guy George was proof that John Wilkes Booth escaped. Eventually, Bates sells this guy's dead body that's mummified, and it was hauled around to like carnival sideshows and like put up in like, basically like weird, like, like freak shows and stuff as like, this is John Wilkes Booth's actual body. And today it's said to be in the hands of like a private collector. And now, and most people are like, okay, the mummy's not actually John Wilkes Booth, but it's like a weird probably the weirdest like post-assassination like lore saga thing to like come out of that era, that people actually paid money, like a nickel, to go see this mummy. Just some random dead crazy guy that claimed he was John Wilkes Booth. Pretty wild. There's so much weird stuff with this whole story. It's crazy. And you can literally go to the Booth Theater. It's in Manhattan. It's like near like, it's like Midtown, I think. And it's like a famous theater that's still there to this day, named after Edwin Booth. And there's actually a statue of Edwin Booth, which is kind of wild. Like there's just a statue of like the brother of the guy that killed one of America's most infamous presidents. Wild stuff. Anyway, what did you guys think? Is there anything that I missed from this? If you're like a hardcore, history nerd like myself, tell me if there's anything that I missed. Please drop a comment. If there's any other like weird synchronicity stuff, I'd love like the crazy, like weird, sort of threads that tie all this stuff together. Please drop a comment. Let me know. I read all of them. Also, the top comment on this video and all the future videos, you're getting free merch. We will find you. Okay. We'll have General Stanton and his Secretary of War. We will hunt you down, whether you're in a tobacco barn or whatever. We're going to get you a free hoodie if you are the top comment. Also, I'm on the road, Mark Gagnon Live. Check me out. Also, check out our other channels. We got Camp Gagnon with a bunch of interviews and a bunch of other crazy, awesome stuff. And then we got Religion Camp, where we specifically focus in on all the religious topics. And of course, History Camp. Please drop a comment, like, subscribe. All that stuff really helps out the channel, and share it with your friends, whatever you got to do. I appreciate you all dearly, and I'm excited to see you in the future to talk about the past. Thanks so much. See you then. Peace.